Good afternoon. I'm David Wilco, and I have the great good fortune to introduce this afternoon's Bradford seminar speaker, Daniel Simberloff. And Dan is the Gore Hunger Professor of Environmental Science at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. And I can say without anyone accusing me of exaggeration that he is one of the most influential ecologists of the past half century. In fact, his influence begins even more than a half century ago in the late 1960s with his dissertation research, which he did at Harvard with E.O. Wilson. And as a historical note to those who may not be familiar with that work, he eliminated all of the insects living on some tiny mangrove islands off the coast of Florida, an exceedingly difficult task, and then watched the species recolonize them, looking to see if the recolonization of the islands followed the predictions of island biogeographic theory as first articulated by MacArthur and Wilson. And I think even in that first paper, which is a set of papers, which are absolutely classics in both ecology and in conservation science, you see so much of the hallmarks of Dan's career, which is the rigorous testing of popular concepts in ecology and conservation science. And so in the 1980s and beyond, Dan took a critical eye to the literally hundreds of studies that were purporting to show, for example, that natural communities were structured by competition between species and other such factors, and made the argument in a highly influential and large body of literature that we have to distinguish, we have to learn how to distinguish between true patterns, patterns that reflect underlying causal processes that we think are operating, and the sorts of pseudo-patterns that can arise simply by chance. And he was a early developer and advocate for the use of null models in ecological research and in conservation science research, which has been exceedingly important for really all subsequent generations of researchers. In the area of conservation science, the area closest to me, Dan has challenged us in a very good way to re-examine what I might call the sacred shibboleths of conservation science. Things like, are large nature preserves always preferable to small ones? And if not always, when? Is connecting isolated patches of habitat with corridors always a net plus for biodiversity? And if not, when is it not? He's always asking us to think about what the data actually show, and in particular to focus on the natural history of the species involved. Caution to not be too quick to make broad generalizations when the data do not support those generalizations. And indeed, a fact about Dan that some people are unaware of is he's a very keen and able natural historian. Now, for several decades, he has turned his attention to one of the most profound, yet, in my view, understudied ways in which human beings have altered the Earth's ecosystems. And that's by moving species from one place to another, sometimes intentionally and sometimes accidentally. In aggregate, this transport, plants and animals, has reshaped ecosystems around the world, changed biodiversity on every continent, and affected human health and welfare. We're fortunate that that's what you will be talking with us about today, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Dan Simberloff as our speaker.
Well, thank you very much, David. I do have to accuse you of exaggerating my influence, greatly exaggerating my influence. And thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. My last visit, I got a parking ticket while giving a seminar, and I'm promised that it's not going to happen this time, so we will see. Yeah, so I thought I'd begin with this article in Harper's Magazine that struck me and a lot of other people by David Quammen, the nature writer, and I imagine many of you have read other of his articles. And the point he tried to make was that invasions there's so many of them, they're inexorable, they're growing, and he predicted it was in about a century that the Earth would still be green in many places, but the green would all consist of pretty much the same species, what he called global weeds. And he meant to include animal weeds as well as plant weeds, but of course it's plants that we see. And that metaphor really struck a responsive chord for many people. And this came at about the same time as a number of people were saying, invasions are just so inevitable. There's so many of them, and there's really not much we can do about them except maybe a holding pattern for a while, slowing them down. And so we should not be expending nearly as many resources as we have been, and we should just call them honorary natives or something like that. It was captured really nicely in this this quote from Mark Gardner, who at that time was director of the Darwin Research Station in the Galapagos, and he was talking about this this plant, and that's the plant that he meant by blackberries. And he said, well, we've thrown a lot of resources at it, but it hasn't worked. He conceded that it's really bad. There has been controversy about just how bad really are invasions, but I'm not going to get into that in this talk. And he conceded that. He said we can't do anything about it, and we're spending a lot of time on it. And so we should just pretty much give up. And that he was not the only one speaking in that sort of language at the time. And it almost fit with David Quammen's metaphor, and also at around the same time from a different direction, a very academic direction. The idea of homogenization of biodiversity arose, and it was captured especially in this 2001 book by Julie Lockwood and Mike McKinney. And it's simply that if you look at different states in the U.S. or other different contiguous regions and how many species they share, in the 19th century it wasn't many. In the 20th century it was more, and by now it's more and more and more. So he said the Earth is being homogenized, and I believe Jack Putz at the University of Florida was the first ones to use the term homogecene as the age in which that we're in. I'm not sure, but he's the first one I knew of who did that, and that's sort of become a trendy topic, and it's and people still publish lots of stats showing homogenization as one outcome, and so I thought I'd begin by addressing that metaphor and talking a bit about what I think is going to happen, and if there is going to be a planet of weeds, and how long it will take. Quammen suggests it would take about a century, and this is what we would see. And as with many ideas, compelling ideas in conservation and ecology, there aren't really many data that directly address this image, even though a lot of them look like they do, including the homogenization data. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So here's a good example. What's going to happen in Europe, and they were particularly interested in how ongoing land use change was going to affect invasion rate. And so you see here that in some regions it's going to be more invasions, others it's going to be less. But the important thing, and the increase and decrease are positive and negative percent changes, they say, in level of invasion. But what they mean by that is just the number of species, the number of invasive species as a fraction of the total flora in this case. But that's not really what the metaphor is about. The metaphor is about sort of an unbroken sea of non-native vegetation. And this is just about how many species there are. So it's a hypothesis, I guess, that if there are more species, they'll cover more of the landscape. But there aren't data of that sort yet, or many data. I'll talk about that in a moment. Here's another example, again, for Europe. And again, if you look closely, it shows that there are more and more non-native plant species in European countries and rate of increase, but it's all about just the number of species that are present, not about their impact or about the coverage of the earth. So again, one could imagine that it's reasonable to expect that at some point some fraction of them will spread and cover a large area. But that's just a hypothesis, and the data have yet to be examined or gathered even. Here's an example that has been pretty influential and is very interesting. So what Bethany Bradley and her coworkers did. Are you one of the coworkers of this paper?
Not on this one.
Okay. But what Bradley does is she does a lot of environmental niche modeling to see, to try to estimate what the possible range of a species will be that's been introduced but is still spreading, or it certainly hasn't been there for a very long time. And what she and her co-authors did in this case is they were looking at 50 by 50 kilometer squares of the US and how many were occupied by which species. And for each species, native or introduced, they did an environmental niche model to see what the potential range would be, and they measured the current range. And infilling is the fraction of the possible range as generated by the model that's actually occupied now. And they did that for, they separated out alien plants that are not yet invasive but exist somewhere, and those non-native plants that are actually spreading in the landscape. So those are the two left, and they did it for native plants. And the result was that, first of all, there were two sort of chilling results. The first was that the predicted range that could be occupied by the invasive plant species was on average quite a bit greater than the possible range of most of the native species. And secondly, the infilling was lower. That is, they were currently occupying much less of the range they're going to occupy at some point in the future than for the native species. This was all without predictions from climate change. But again, it doesn't really say anything about what they'll do or how much coverage or even, what does the range of the species really mean? It's not what fraction of their range do they dominate in terms of aerial coverage or what have you. It's not exactly related to the metaphor of a planet of weeds or the Homogenization. And as a final sort of chilling high-profile paper was this one by Hanno Siebens and co-authors. And what they did here, let's see. Not turned on. There we go. What they did here was, so here you have different groups of species, and here are the different continents. And for various groups of species, they just tallied the number of new invasions in 5-year intervals. And their point was, they're by and large not asymptotic. For most of them, they're just going up and up and up. So it's not like we've reached a limit. So the suggestion or the implication that it's going to get worse and worse and worse. But again, it's not, it relates to the idea of a planet of weeds, but it's not a direct, even the prediction, it's about numbers of species again, not about the, what kind of impact they're going to have. And so there's a problem here, and that is that there are data on coverage by different plants, but they're generally in smaller areas. They're single particular species that someone is interested in, and they're published in a different literature than this sort of literature. Often they're related to management and trying to prioritize species for management. So to give an example, where I was talking to someone earlier here about stilt grass, Microsedum viminum, sometimes called Japanese stilt grass, or there's other common names for it, which is very common around here. It was introduced actually in Knoxville many years ago, and it's one of our major invasive plants, and it really does cover a large part of the ground cover. And because of that, in some areas in eastern Tennessee, there's been very careful mapping of just how much of it there is. Not just, it's everywhere, but in most cases, in many places, there's not much of it, even though it's there. And others, it is the ground cover. And so there has been some work of that sort for that species. And you could say that for a number of other plants, but there aren't that many data of that. Now, that entire area of research is in the process of being radically transformed by the advent of drones, especially drones, sometimes other remote sensing. And so I don't know if anyone here is using them, but several people in my department at the University of Tennessee, are using drones to get exactly that kind of data over very large areas that would not have been tractable, even 10 years ago. And the technology is increasing very rapidly. So I think it's quite possible that, within another 20 or 30 years, we'll really have the data to look at this whole idea of an overwhelming expanse of non-native vegetation covering the earth, or whatever you say. The forces that are leading to the increasing number of species, and that Quammen thinks will lead us to a planet of weeds, they're quite well known and studied, and they're still with us, and they're not declining. The main one is habitat destruction and transformation, like this, and the relationship of the initial disturbance that leads to the habitat transformation, and then the new habitats that there and which species are present has been widely studied for both plants and animals. And of course, it ends up being a new habitat, so of course you would expect the native species that have been present not to be well adapted to it. And also the disturbance itself often liberates some resources, like soil nutrients that are easily monopolized by some invasive plants. So, that's the single major one. And the second one is the often accelerating amount of travel and trade. So, here are the data for container traffic. And of course, this was before the pandemic, so there will be an impact. But we already know from the recession of 2009, which also slowed down these stats, that they recovered remarkably quickly. So it doesn't change the overall kind of prediction. So the forces that bring new species to non-native areas they're there, and they're increasing. And then more recently, there's been a lot of focus on climate change. And here, there's not just one point of view about this. And here's one of Bethany Bradley's papers that you are a co-author on. And this is an important paper because it's the first of what has turned out to be a flood of papers that are looking at how climate change is going to affect the invasions by particular species. And this particular paper is one of the first. There were about three, two by the same group, actually. You're part of another one. Attracted a lot of attention and probably inspired many of the others. So I'm an editor-in-chief of the journal Biological Invasions, which is the main journal focused just on invasions. And now, every year, I'd say we get about 50 submissions where someone has done the same kind of thing with some new species, okay? And we're not the only journal publishing this sort of paper. So it's become a very active area of research, and there's lots of debates about the environmental niche model that you actually use to do this and whether it's the right one or there's a better one. And there's debates about which global circulation model of climate you should use. But those are all just arguments around the edges. The general idea is well accepted, and lots of people do it now. And here in this very early paper, they're looking at cheatgrass, which is an Asian, Eurasian invasive species that it occupies well over 100 million acres in the United States. And although I've never seen data on what fraction of those it totally dominates, it's got to be tens of millions of acres. And I'll show a picture later. There's many areas where this is all you see. And it's of great economic significance to ranchers, as well as, of course, a conservation dilemma. And so here what they've done is they looked at what's going to happen with cheatgrass in several decades, given climate change. And their result was that in some places where it isn't now, it's going to be. In other places where it is now, it's either not going to be or it's not going to be very common. And the whole range is going to shift somewhat. I would say that in most cases, most of the work that's been done of this sort, and there literally are hundreds of papers, predict it's going to be worse. That is, there are more species that would not have been able to get a foothold in the first place that will, and there will be more range expansions than there will be contractions, but not universally. There will be another paper of that Bradley has led suggests there's going to be lots of opportunities for restoration in the areas where the range for particular species is going to shift, so that those species will no longer be well suited for an area they now dominate. But overall, I would say very much overall, the picture is the climate change is going to exacerbate the problem. So if you look at the sorts of data we've been looking at, even though the data aren't yet there to examine directly this metaphor of a planet of weeds, everything looks worse. And so the next thing we might ask is, how long is it going to take? Quammen said, well, within about a century or century and a half, we're going to see this. And I don't know about that. Here's the idea of biological inertia, and that it takes a good while for species and for entire communities and ecosystems to change. I think the first person to discuss this in terms of invasions was a book review of Elton's book, The Ecology of Invasions of Animals and Plants, which was an unusual book. That book was it's often said to be sort of the founding document of modern invasion biology. Even though it's a popular book, it was written, and it's been reprinted over and over again, recently with chapter forwards by Tony Ricciardi and me. So you should all buy it, actually. It's a great book, but it was written for a general audience. It was basically adapted from a series of BBC radio broadcasts. And here was a review of it. by a scientist. And he said, well, Elton painted a very dismal picture. He didn't really posit a planet of weeds, but he pointed in that direction. And what Pearsall said was, well, not so fast. It may happen, but it's not going to happen that quickly because there's inertia. And Pearsall especially pointed to forests and how long it takes, even in the face of various things like land use change, if you don't totally eliminate the community to begin with, for a new species to get in and dominate. It takes centuries. And he thought for much of Great Britain, which is what he was writing about, it would probably take 500 years for the scenarios that Elton was talking about to come to pass. And the paper by Betsy Von Holly, Hazel Delcourt, and me in 2003, we may have coined the term. I don't think Pearsall used the term inertia, but that's what he was talking about. And what we were pointing to was there are a number of other things that plants do, in addition to just being there, that change the environment in such a way that it might not be so easy for many other species to get in. They change the soil in certain ways, soil nutrients, the structure of the soil, and of course, for some plants, even if they die, they're going to be there. The remains of them will be there for centuries. And we also pointed to some well-known, fairly recent geological data that shows that even in the face of rapid climate change, in this case, it often takes a few centuries for the plant species to catch up. And that's all the work on the migration of trees, especially in North America. There are very good data on this, as climate changed, over the last 20,000 years. And the ranges of almost all North American trees, and the data can be gained by looking at pollen grains in sediments. So it's an entire field of palynology, and it shows that even the fastest moving trees that are moving southward in the face of climate change, it took them a couple centuries to get to their new range limits. And the ones that move more slowly, which were usually more heavily that have heavy seeds, sometimes took 400 or 500 years. And that kind of work is, very well established. And so we pointed to those data. And I added this other paper by Downey and Richardson because they point to the fact that seeds can remain in the soil viable for a very long time, for many, many plant species, in some cases up to 4 centuries. And so, there are going to be native seeds, and there will eventually be introduced species seeds. And their argument is you have to take this into account when you predict what's going to be happening 100 years from now. So all of these forces may act to slow down the achievement of this idea of a planet of weeds. And then here's a paper that looks at what they think is going to happen in 1 century. Again, Bethany Bradley is part of it. And basically what they did was they made sort of a broad brush estimate of the forces moving species around in graph B, and in graph C, what's the likelihood that they could establish, and they sort of multiplied those two features to come up with an overall what they called threat of invasion. And they found only about 1/6 of the Earth is likely to be highly threatened, and much of it not much. Unfortunately, Princeton, of course, as well as Knoxville, is going to be highly threatened in the next century. But so this is sort of a very broad brush picture. But it suggests that whatever is going to happen, it won't happen, in 100 years, that the whole Earth is going to be homogenized in planet of weeds. If we look at particular habitats and what's happened in the face of invasions now that they've been studied a lot, forests cover about 30% of the Earth. And there are invasions into forests, but they've not really globally been very heavily invaded. And it's happening. Where you see invasions by trees especially is in places like where there hadn't been trees before in higher elevations, or where the vegetation, as in steppe, or in Finbosch in South Africa, where there weren't trees to begin with. Now there are trees. But there are invasions in the forest. It's just they take a very long time. This is something I've actually worked on with my students. We've worked a lot on the invasion by North American trees, especially conifers, into forests in the Patagonian Andes. And at first, when I first started working there in the 1990s, I was sort of staggered that a whole bunch of trees that had been introduced in the 1920s and 30s were present in the places where the plantations where they planted them, but you just didn't see individuals even in treefall areas more than 100 meters from the plantations. But now, with 20 years of data, we know that it is happening. And the first one to start to move substantially was Douglas fir, and now ponderosa pine and lodgepole pine are spreading into the forest. So it's taken about 70 or 80 years. I mean, we're about to submit another manuscript. It's a good part of the story is that the mycorrhizal fungi were very important. They were introduced, but nothing much was moving the fungi. It was just the mycelium growing. There weren't squirrels around digging them up and moving them in that case. But there are other studies of forest invasion showing that invasion happens, but it often takes a really long time. But it's happening. If you look at grasslands, which occupy more of the earth, probably around 40% or so, it's happening more quickly. And here's an example of cheatgrass that I talked about before. And there are many places in the West where this is what you see. It's dominated by cheatgrass. Cheatgrass has been in the West now for over 100 years, but it became dominant within many areas within about 50 years. There's a lot of research on the history of cheatgrass, and it's spread. And even Darwin, when he was crossing Patagonia during the voyage of the Beagle, it was a really striking statement that he made about the pampas. 1832, he pointed out that the native vegetation was totally dominated by these two introduced plants. And he knew that they were introduced, knew where they came from. He said that's all you see. And so grasslands, it's happening quite quickly. And I've not seen yet a credible estimate of what fraction of grasslands really are now totally dominated by invasive plants, but it's surely high. Fires and increasing fires have actually sped that up, because many of the invasive grass species that are present are very well adapted to frequent and hot fires, much more so than the natives. And grazing in many parts of the world has a lot to do with it. If you look at wetlands cover something like 6 or 7% of the Earth's surface. And in many places, they're being replaced by introduced species. These are all cases from North America, and one that's present around here, and it's probably the biggest problem in North America is Phragmites. It's all over, and it's replacing native species and changing entire wetlands in spite of very substantial efforts to try to control it. Spartina and the hybrid of Spartina alterniflora in California has begun to replace the native Spartina foliosa, and Also in California, rhododendron, which is now, giant reeds, now being planted at least in Texas and Florida as a biofuel feedstock, is highly invasive, and they have major programs, two of them in Southern California, to try to control it. And yet it's being planted. So grassland, again, as with grasslands, I haven't really seen a credible estimate of what fraction already of wetlands are dominated by invasives, but it must be substantial. And then a final thing that I might point out is if you think about the chestnut blight, it's a very good example. The chestnut blight got in from Asia, got into North America right around the turn of the 20th century. And within about 50 years, it had pretty much eliminated chestnut, native chestnut, from its entire range. Okay, and now some of you have surely read, and maybe someone is actually doing research on, there's now a genetically modified chestnut that's resistant to it. I won't talk about that. But the point is that despite the fact that chestnut had this very large range and was the dominant species in many of the mid-elevation forests, so like around Knoxville, it was the dominant mid-elevation tree species, very dominant. But despite the fact that it was all eliminated in about 50 years, it was replaced by native species, because that's what was there. It was oaks primarily, all over its range. But if something like that were to happen now, there'd be lots of other candidates, some of which are non-native, that might occur. There's another example that isn't as well known because it happened a few thousand years ago, but hemlock was eliminated from much of its, from fossil pollen. Hemlock, which had been a major constituent of many forests in the eastern U.S., suddenly plummeted to where it's not even present in many of the sediment cores that people got very rapidly. And it's assumed that it was because of an introduced insect or an introduced pathogen, like with chestnut blight. And then over about 3 or 4 centuries, it gradually recovered. And while it was absent, it was native species that replaced it. But of course, that's what was there, was native species. If such a thing were to happen now, there'd be many other species that are not native that could replace it. So, all of that suggests to me that if we don't do anything, we're probably not going to see a planet of weeds in 100 years, the way Kwame was guessing. But I have little doubt that within about 300 or 400 years, and certainly, 500 or 600, that really the landscape is going to be totally dominated by non-native species. So what to do about it? And I give a course in invasion biology every year at the University of Tennessee, and I spend about a quarter of it talking about existing technologies and whether they've worked or not, and how well they've worked. Well, I'm not going to do that here because I don't have a quarter of a course to talk about it. Basically, there are 3 main approaches that people have taken: mechanical or physical control, either by hand or using machines or what have you, chemicals, and biological control. And there have been increases in or changes in the technologies and great improvements in some of them. So it's not that they've just been these static ideas. And you could point to triumphs in management and sometimes eradication for all of those. And I do that in my course. But so, they've worked and things have, the tools are there, some tools are there and are getting better. I'm going to talk in a little while more about these new ideas that are just now being implemented. But, the take home so far of actually managing invasions in a way that will forestall the advent of a planet of weeds is not great. For terrestrial invasions, there are I can point to many successes. and not only on islands where there's most of the literature. And what I call maintenance management is where you don't try to eliminate every one, but you can keep it under long-term control by doing something. Biological control is generally aimed at maintenance management. And a lot of these successes are due to improved technologies, usually what we would call incremental, but sometimes sort of great changes in a new way of doing, say, mechanical control or a new kind of chemical. For aquatic systems, there are some successes, but they're almost all in small water bodies. So it's not like we have the technology, if we would only use it, to have a big impact right now. Things are getting better, but they're not so great. Most of this is by chemical control. Not all, but most of it. And marine, there's nothing good to be said about that. There are very few successful eradications, all of them in the very near shore intertidal. A number of high-profile failures where people try to eradicate a marine invader and failed. There's no technology that's been used yet that looks promising on this front. So there are tools for some kinds of invasions. Of course, the issue is, who's going to use them? Where will the resources come from? There would have to be, an international commitment to it and cooperation because it's an international problem. Obviously, species come from one place to go to another, and that hasn't happened yet. The big new kid on the block, from many directions, is genetics. And there are a number of ideas that have been floated, and some have been developed, and a few have been implemented that suggest dramatic improvements in management and even eradication. And I'll talk about the main ones. So the first one hasn't gotten as much press, and that's gene silencing. Because although it rests on genetics, it's not in principle heritable. It's just finding something that prevents a gene that's necessary for survival and reproduction from operating. So a knockout. And the idea of using this to control invasions has been around for a while. And for a long time, people were developing knockout agents to silence genes, mostly for insects, for a whole bunch of them. This one was about the Colorado potato beetle. Or most of it was about that. It had been worked on for controlling mice also. And the approach was you find the silencing agent and you get it in a carrier so that when the animal eats it, somehow enough of it gets from the digestive system into the body of the animal and silences the gene, kills it. And there was quite a bit of progress for at least two of the insects on this. There was, to my knowledge, one major project, but only one on plants, and that was to do it with Phragmites, which seems not yet to have eventuated in something that's working. So that was the idea. So it wasn't heritable. It was something you would keep applying. It would be used for maintenance management. And there was great hope that almost all, actually not almost, all of these techniques are basically bootlegged off medical advances and agricultural advances. And it's where ecologists and invasion scientists have either teamed up with people doing work in medicine or agriculture or simply learned how to use their techniques. But the next thing that happened under the radar really changed the whole landscape of gene silencing, and that was suddenly Monsanto, which is now part of Bayer, got approval for a gene silencing that was actually it was heritable, because what they did was they put a transgene in a crop plant, in this case corn, maize that once it was eaten, in this case by the southern corn rootworm, which is like one of the very worst of the corn pests, would silence the gene and kill it. And so no one in invasion science even really knew about this. I think, you know, the patent application, it was approved, and you can now buy this stuff, SmartStax Pro, and they've improved it, so now it not only silences genes in southern corn rootworm, but in a whole bunch of lepidopteran pests of corn. And you know, if any of you are planning on planting corn commercially here in Princeton, go to Bayer, and you know you can buy SmartStax Pro. It's available. And RNAi is RNA interference. That's how you silence genes in most cases. So there it is. But this is very different because it is genetically transmitted. So it's not just that you're spraying something on a plant and the insect eats it. And so it requires approval from several different entities, and it's gotten it in the U.S. And that led to, or maybe it was already ongoing at the time, a number of other efforts of that sort in agriculture. So you have the brown marmorated stink bug here. How many have seen it? Everyone has, right? You have it in your homes. Well, here's the answer. DuPont has done the same thing. But we know it because it's in our homes. It's a terrible agricultural pest. And they're engineering several plants to have a silencing element. The patent application I found was in 2019. I don't know where it sits now, but it is exactly, as you read the patent, they're doing exactly the same thing. It's a transgene. And generally with transgenes, they don't have to tell you where they got it, because it's a trade secret. But in any event, so it won't help you in your home unless you plant a crop that has the silencing element. But it's another way to control the stink bug. Surely, if it takes hold, it'll affect the entire population. So gene silencing is one technique. It just hasn't attracted that much attention. But one could imagine using it just in the original idea of spraying it on something. But it hasn't been developed in that way, except in agriculture, I guess because there's no resources for it. And who's going to pay for it? The other techniques that I'll talk about trace back to a classic, much of it traces back to a classic paper that I'll mention by W.D. Hamilton, who was one of the great evolutionists of the 20th century, made many contributions that were really, that affect the way we think about evolution today. And one of them was this bombshell paper in 1967. So most of you weren't born then, but up until that time, we all learned in genetics courses or in evolution courses, and we still do, about meiotic drive. And that is where meiosis is not a fair process, and it's not like 50% of this allele go into the gametes and 50% of the other allele, but for one reason or another, one allele, or one chromosome bearing one allele, is incorporated in many more of the gametes than the other allele. And it was sort of a puzzling phenomenon that was known in a very few cases in nature. And Hamilton explains why that is with mathematical models. And what he showed was that once he showed that in certain circumstances, especially when associated with the sex chromosomes, either the X or the Y, if one of those is driven, the population goes extinct very, very rapidly, because you end up quickly with just one sex. And that's the end of it. And he said that the circumstances where that doesn't happen are very special circumstances, and he described what those were. There were two cases known at that time. One of them was a T allele in mice, which is still known, and it had to do with their population structure forestalling the inevitable all-male population. So, but the important thing was this involves heritable change. What, it is a gene that causes one of a pair of chromosomes to be preferentially incorporated in the gamete. And that has led to several ideas that I'll talk about in a moment. The other paper was not nearly as high profile. I should mention, at the very end of it, Hamilton said, and we could use this to control agricultural pests. All we have to do is to find a gene that causes meiotic drive and somehow, get the pest population to incorporate it. It'll spread through the population. It'll destroy it. It was 1967. There was no way to do such a thing. There's no such thing as transgenes in 1967. So it's this sort of cool idea out there. But of course, now we can do things like that, right? And people are, and I'll come to that in a moment. The other paper is much more recent by Gutierrez and team, one of two papers. And what they pointed to was that in fishes, and it can be done in some other species, but in fishes, you can change the phenotypic sex of a species. And it's done in aquaculture for a number of species where they use estrogen or estradiol to feminize species because they don't really want phenotypic males. And so their idea was, well, you could use these sex-reversed fishes to, if you had the right breeding scheme, to get what they called super males or YY males, and then you could release them. And unlike a regular XY male, all of its gametes are going to be Y. And so if you released enough of them, the wild-type females would be producing more and more males. But you'd have to keep doing it. It's not heritable the same way as Hamilton's saying. Well, sure enough, someone's done that. And they're testing it now on invasive brook trout in Idaho. They came up with a very clever two-generation breeding scheme for brook trout that produces YY males and YY females also. And they can get hundreds of them. So all of these fishes, half of which are phenotypically females, the other are males, they're all YY. And they've now released them into 4 streams in Idaho. They're invaded by brook trout from the east. It's a problem there largely because they brook trout hybridize with bull trout, which is a federally threatened native species. So there's been a lot of attempt to control brook trout where it's in the west, and this is their idea to do it. So they've released them into 4 streams. 2 of them they tried to remove as many brook trout as they could beforehand with electrofishing, and others they didn't even do that. Now they're watching to see what happens. And this could be done with many other fishes. For many fishes that are in commercial fisheries, the technology already exists. For other fishes, there's no reason why it wouldn't work. It could be done for some other species. Here is another story. So this is the famous Oxytech Mosquito, which they patented, I think, in 2008 and called it the Oxytech Friendly Mosquito. So this is Aedes aegypti, and it is the vector for yellow fever especially, but also for chikungunya, and later it turned out for Zika. And what they did was they used a transgene. This is a team in England at Oxford. They formed a corporation because there's big bucks in this. And they used a transgene and they got it into Aedes aegypti. What does this transgene do? It's actually lethal, except it's inactivated by tetracycline. And so what you do is you rear up a gazillion of these mosquitoes in an insectary in the presence of tetracycline. And so they live, but they're carrying this transgene. And then they employ an army of people to separate the males and females. They throw out the females, and you have all these males carrying this transgene. You release them into nature, and so the wild type females mate with them. And the idea is then that all of their offspring are going to have this gene, and they'll die. And so it basically causes, no more reproduction. You have to release a lot of them. And it was quite controversial about, as you can see, from this letter to the editor, and then a news story about it, like, hey, could the gene get into some other species we don't know about by some means? Are we really sure that this is safe? The mosquitoes don't know any borders, and all of that pretty much went by the wayside when Zika hit, which you remember, because Aedes aegypti carries Zika virus. And so they set up big the Brazilian government said, go ahead and do it. And they set up big insectaries in 2 places. One was Piracicaba, reared millions of them, released them, and it worked. It knocked back the populations over 90% in each of the 2 areas, and pretty much stopped the spread of Zika in at least one of them. And now they've sort of perfected even improved the Oxytech Mosquito, because what they have now is a transgene. It causes the female bearers to be wingless, so they die in nature, unless there's tetracycline, but the males don't. And so the female that carries the gene and her male offspring are going to survive, and they'll have the gene, and they'll be there. You won't even have to rear 1 million of them. They'll be transmitting them. Anyway, so they did that in Brazil, and it worked. And then that led to a controversy, because it turned out, or it looks initially like it turned out, like some of those offspring didn't die. And in one of natural populations, they could show that some genes from about 3% of the population had genes, not that transgene, but genes from the mosquitoes that had been released. And that, of course, led to yet another big science story, and Oxytech's complained about that. But now it turns out that paper was wrong. And here's the editorial expression of concern. It should be retracted. If you look at it really closely, it's not right. So the Oxytech mosquito is there. It's now being used. It's been permitted in other places, including in Asia, as well as much of South America. And Oxytech has now, in the process of developing analogous friendly insects for at least these 5 species using transgenes. But that's just Oxytech. And these are all agricultural pests. So one could imagine that you could do this, with some environmental pests if you wanted to. And this is all before the use of gene drives. And now we have gene drives, and it was immediately recognized, and here's a paper that pointed out in one of the earlier papers that gene drives could be used in various ways and these would be heritable. So there'd be discussion about this, and they'd have to be permitted, but they could be used to control non-native species in various ways. And it was pointed out right away by the very people doing this work that, we got to think really carefully about this, because we'll sort of be changing nature, and it's heritable, so we want to make sure we knew what we were doing and minimize the possibility of unintended consequences. And at the International Conservation Congress in Hawaii in 2016, a manifesto was distributed and signed by many prominent people. Jane Goodall is the most prominent, saying we should never ever use gene drives for any reason period in conservation. It's immoral, et cetera, et cetera. And an NGO on whose board I serve, we lost 2 board members because we said we were going to look into this for our purposes. So it's very, very controversial. And it became even more controversial when one of the people that developed the idea, Esvelt, who was actually, the senior author of this paper, seemed to have sort of a change of heart and said, yeah, this is pretty dangerous. We ought to think really carefully about this. And that was picked up by many news sources saying, hey, someone who even wanted to do it is now saying it's too risky. He didn't really say it's too risky. He said we have to think of procedures that would minimize the risk. I was always somewhat skeptical of the risk because I assumed, just as Hamilton showed in 1976, that any heritable, gene that was going to, be killing individuals or changing the population, there'd automatically be very strong selection for genes on the other chromosomes to neutralize it. And other people said that as well, but Esvelt and several of his co-authors published a model saying, well, no, it could happen so quickly that there won't even be time under certain circumstances. And other people have criticized this model. However, it's already happening. I mean, it's too late. There are people doing this, and there are at least 2 very well-resourced ongoing projects using gene drives, almost always in a way that's sort of analogous to the idea of changing the sex ratio, the way Hamilton said. One is target malaria. It's all about using gene drives on Anopheles mosquitoes to control malaria. They have 3 different approaches, all of them generated by gene drives. They've tested them in large cages, and it seems to work. And that's going to be used, released to nature very soon, for sure. And the other one is G-Bird, which is trying to do the same thing for invasive rodents, especially rats. And there are 7 organizations that are funding it. Most of the actual research is being done at Texas A&M and at Adelaide and through CSIRO. And again, they're using gene drives in all 3 of these approaches. And 2 of them do involve ultimately changing the sex ratio. So you end up with all males. And they believe they're going to be able to do field tests for at least 2 of these methods within the year. And I know of at least 3 other ongoing projects of this sort, and they haven't really published, how far along they are, but they're being done by competent people. So of course you have to worry about it. And there was this wonderful paper, some of you may have seen, Can Any Idiot Do It? And John Cohen is this wonderful science reporter for Science, and he went into a lab and tried for 2 days to use a gene drive, and he failed. And so he said, but what he said at the end was that any can't do it. It takes at least basic laboratory skills. So I did not find that comforting. And now you can order CRISPR kits and do it in your garage. So who knows? So to sum up, with the existing technologies, we could probably slow down greatly the planet of weeds. And I think with these new ones, we could do even better than that, maybe, if the resources were put behind it. It's going to take commitment, and it's going to take international commitment and cooperation, and it isn't yet happening. But it could. I think the technology could help a lot. I guess that's my take-home point. So I've, as always, gone over, but you spent way too long introducing me. So if there are questions.
I know folks are on schedules. Let me suggest we'll take a question here, and then Dan, if you can remain at the podium for a few minutes,
sure.
Folks can come forward and have more informal conversations with him. So I will have to run to teach, so I want to thank you again for a
Thank you.
really interesting, terrific talk. So do we have a question from the audience? Yes.
Oh, I wanted to ask about, if plants are invasive in part because they aren't being eaten by the local wildlife. Has there been any research on wildlife changing their tastes so that they'll start eating things like cheatgrass and stilt grass and things
Yeah.
like that?
A little, not much, but where there is a lot of research of that sort is to try to find biological control agents, insects that eat them in their native range, test them to make sure that they don't eat a species if we were to introduce them. And actually there's been a program for stilt grass, but sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and there's a lot of ongoing research about that. As far as the evolution of new tastes, much of that or ability to thrive on a new species, a lot of that literature is also in the biological control literature, because there is concern that you could do all the testing in the world, show that it's not going to eat one of your native species, then you introduce it and it does. And that's a very active area of research, and all I can say is there are several cases where species appear to have evolved, species of insects. I don't know of vertebrate research. There might be some. Species of insects have evolved pretty quickly to be able to use a new host plant. So, but there's a lot of research of that sort is going on.
Well, thank you again so much.
Okay.
I think at that point we have to close up, but you're welcome to ask individual questions of Dan if you have some. So thank you again.
Thank you.